Patterns of happiness are frameworks that always work. They are tools and practices that will bring permanent change to your life for better. We're not looking for temporary solutions. We change and transform. We practice what we preach, and we're gonna share it with you here. Be careful, because you can become seriously happier today. You are coming from non-violence therapy background, also connected with family constellations, and you also somehow connected all with neurobiology or neuroscience. Just one last thing before I ask you a question. They say that the healer is the healed. So I'm wondering how it started for you and how you started putting it all together, made it into something very special that you do these days.
Yeah. I'm somebody who's intensely curious. So I ran into Nonviolent Communication, which Marshall Rosenberg was the kind of author of, the person who wrote about it and developed the approach to using language. And I thought he was extraordinary. So I went to see him. And in his later years, he had started to develop dementia. And so he would kind of get on to a particular story that he told before, and he would tell it again. And so I was at his workshop, and I had listened to many of his recordings and CDs. So everything in the workshop was already familiar to me. And I was like, oh dear, I've come all this way, and he's not saying anything new. We didn't know at that time that he had dementia, but it makes sense now in retrospect that he would get on a particular familiar track and just stay on it, because that was supportive for him. That was what he could do. And there was a woman who said, I'm doing a live empathy circle if anyone would like to come. And so I was like, yeah, anything, I'll do anything. So I went over with her to a different building, and there were a number of people there. And she said, well, we're going to listen to whoever wants to be heard in a different way. We're not going to give advice. We're not going to tell people how to think differently. We're going to be listening for what are the deep longings that underlie the language. Nobody else wanted to go, so I decided to work on something that I thought was absolutely frozen and would never shift. It was an experience I was having with our adopted son, where I couldn't even raise my arms to like do an air hug. I mean, my body was frozen in relationship with a person who was a child for me. So people were doing these empathy guesses, and my sensation was like of being a little boat in an ocean. And I would go down into the trough of the wave really deep, and then I would come back up, and somebody would make a needs guess, and it would like let me orient, and then I would go down again. A needs guess is, in nonviolent communication, it's like, were you really longing to know that you could be loved? Do you ache for connection? You know, it's just like really big, abstract ideas that are foundational and hugely important for humans, but that people rarely talk about. And I had this experience of a spontaneous recall of memory of reaching towards my mother and feeling her stiffen and recoil. And my mother was a trauma survivor. I recently found a newspaper clipping from her mother getting a divorce from her father that described one of the nights when the father was trying to kill the family. So my mother had very, very early trauma that was really intense. And so her body carries the trauma. You know, there's this is what we're working with in Constellations all the time, is the epigenetic transmission of traumatic experiences that are living in the bodies and the cells and the epigenetic sheath of our mothers and fathers and grandparents. And so it was like I was touching her traumatized body. But for little kids, we always think it's us. We always think, oh, she's recoiling because I'm not good enough. And so then there's this very early contract that we make with ourselves, an unconscious contract that's something like, I will not reach out. I will not reach for a hug. I will only reach if I'm being reached for already. I will not be the initiator because it's too excruciating. I will save myself from excruciating disappointment and pain. All of this kind of flooded in this moment, in this circle. It was like pow, pow, pow. It was like light bulbs going off in my brain. And I left that circle, and all of a sudden I could hug my son. There was no problem. It was just became easy. The process had transformed me. And I'd never had that experience before. And I was like, what the heck happened? So that's it in a nutshell. And I went then into, you can see that this moment actually holds all of the seeds of my future work. It holds the work with language to heal trauma. It holds the intense curiosity about neurobiology. And it also holds this transgenerational piece that we work on so much in Constellations. And the unconscious contracts, which is going to be my next book, which I'm just in negotiation with my publisher about right now.
So that's an epiphany bridge to share
Yeah,
definitely
yeah.
a true story. Thank you for sharing it.
Thank you for asking.
I wanted to ask you, in regards to your story, do you really believe that this change in one's life can happen just instantly? Or is it all the work that you did before that that just was invested into that moment? I'm just curious.
This is such a great question. I love this question. And I think it gets answered most clearly in the work I get to do in the prison. I get to go into a women's prison south of Portland, Oregon, and I get to do constellation work there. And these women have not had a chance, socioeconomically, they haven't had a chance to do any work before this moment where they get to come into the class with me. The ones that come into the class have done a kind of work. Many of them begin to see prison as an opportunity for change, and they long for healing. So that one of the things that people bring in with them when they come into the classes usually, because they're not compulsory classes, they're not mandatory, they don't have to come, they have to want to come. And then they don't have to stay, they can leave if they want to, so they have to want to stay. There's extraordinary life-changing work that happens in the constellations in prison that seems to have nothing to do with any work that has gone before. That we can start from a place where we haven't had a chance to do any work, and we can have extraordinary things happen from both intention and willingness, and from the surprise of being held with warmth and being able to see our own lives.
So it gives hope. You believe that can actually happen at this very moment?
I have a story about that if you would like to hear it.
Definitely. Please share. Please share.
We were working with a woman who said, I have no childhood memories. I said, you have no childhood memories? She said, well, I remember some stuff from before I was 8, but after I was 8, I don't remember anything.
Can I ask you, was it with someone who stays in prison?
Yes, someone who stays in prison. And she said, I would like to have childhood memories. And I said, okay, what happened when you were 8? And she said, well, I was riding my bike with my best friend. And I turned one way, and my best friend turned the other way, and the other way was in the path of a truck. And my best friend was killed suddenly. And I don't have any memories after that. So we did a constellation to kind of regather the part of herself that died with her friend. And then the next time that we got to go into the prison, she came back and she said, I've started to remember my life, and it's very confusing. And now I need help figuring out what it all means. It all comes in and like it just, and I can't make head or tail of it. And so then we worked together and created a chronology for her. She put it outside of herself. She was able to see her life and make sense of it in a new way, and to see the events and see what happened and make sense of what happened. She was probably 34, and she didn't have very many memories from when she was 8 till when she got into prison. So probably 8 to 30, something like that.
Whoa.
Yeah.
It sounds almost impossible, actually.
Yeah.
Can I ask you, is it a job that you do it voluntarily, or?
Yeah, I go into the prison as a volunteer, and I take, when people are students with me in my constellation study groups, when they're working in the master facilitation program with me, then if the prison lets me, then I do a day before the training, and I take the volunteers in with me into the prison so that they can also experience this, because I think that the work in the prison has a kind of purity, just for the very reason of the question that you asked, what about the work that's gone before, that allows people to begin to see the incredible power of constellation work.
From this comes another question that I have in mind. In one of the articles that you wrote, you are telling about explicit and implicit processes that we have inside of us. And sometimes we make a certain resolution for something to happen, but unfortunately, we cannot fulfill it, we cannot complete it, because on this unconscious level, we're somehow still not there. Can you please expand on this one? Because that's one of the topics that I'm constantly thinking about. as how free am I from all these implicit processes, and how to basically make everything that I don't see as seen and noticed. And yeah, I have kind of a mess in this regard. So I'm
Wow.
happy to share everything, or at least
Sure.
some thoughts about that.
Sure. And that, that story is a beautiful starting point because she had implicit memory of her life, but she didn't have, it was like the shock of the experience of the accident took her explicit making machinery offline, and it just didn't come back online, right? So she was functional, but not able to really put things together. Things didn't make sense in a deep way because the right hemisphere, the right hippocampus, is the part of the brain that makes the implicit make sense. And the left hemisphere, so scientists believe that to some extent, the right hemisphere, the entire right hemisphere, is the home of the implicit. And that things become explicit when they're moved into language, and when they're brought into the left hemisphere and moved into language.
Do you mean that they become explicit where we actually say it like aloud, or do you mean that we make the statement, this idea in mind?
I wonder about that as well. And I haven't seen any research that would help me to answer that question. I suspect that it depends on different people, the way they think and how they are with their own brain and their own language. I suspect it's individual because some people will write in order to make things explicit. Some people will speak. Some people have everything formulated before they speak. And some people discover what's true for them as they speak. So I think that for each different kind of brain, there's a different way of making implicit explicit. That's my suspicion, but I haven't seen research that backs me up on it. But it's what feels true to me as I listen to people. Because some people, myself included, obviously have no idea what they think until they open their mouths and start to talk about it. And some people come out with these beautiful, fully crafted, already completely constructed ideas that I think have already been processed there and made into explicit, even though the person hasn't spoken yet. What do you think?
That's a great one. For me, sometimes I know for sure that I feel that there is some inspiration inside of me, but it's not in words yet. And then I just start talking and I feel that something is actually happening through me, but I wouldn't really be able to put it into words before I started.
Yeah, so there are
And
two parts.
yes, so I believe that inside of me there are two different people. Sometimes it's a very adequate person, logical, that can put things into words easily before and to plan things. And sometimes I'm in this, oh, okay, what's going to happen or not going to happen? Because sometimes I start speaking and then I find myself in a dead end. But sometimes it comes to something beautiful. So for me, it's different. And I was really curious.
To come back to your question, there's no way to make everything that's implicit explicit. It's an enormity of what's flowing into us in terms of the felt sense of being in the world is exponentially, like millions of exponentially times greater than what we can ever put into explicit. So the implicit processing is continually happening. And the only thing that really gives us directionality, I think, this is my theory, is when we have an intention. So, for example, whatever intention you have guides your movement through the implicit sea of felt sense experience. So if we are holding an intention, for example, to do no harm, then we'll be in relationship with our implicit in a different way than if we're holding an intention to become a multimillionaire. We'll be traveling through the world of felt sense and harvesting and gathering different elements of the ongoing constellation of life, depending on how we're guiding ourselves with our rudder of intention through the sea of the implicit.
It makes sense, definitely. I mean, it's not that I'm just trying immediately to feel, okay, yes, I guess that's what works. When I have an intention, when I was sure what I really wanted to express, but I didn't really have a plan before that. But at least I had some idea that I didn't want to harm this person or that I
Yeah.
want to make peace.
Yeah.
Then the thoughts start actually becoming sentences that make it work for the two of us in conversation. I guess, yes, I guess you're totally right. In the sense that now I understand it for myself too. I've listened to your interviews as well in podcasts and other podcasts. One of the topics that I was really excited about that you started discussing was about amygdala. You were sharing that amygdala is very special in the sense that there is no time for it,
Right.
and that it holds certain kind of memory. I would like you to ask you to share a little bit from the scientific point of view how it works, and also the other very factual parts of our brain, how they work together, and also why does amygdala exist if it brings so much trouble from time to time?
Well, there are two amygdala. There's one in the left hemisphere and one in the right hemisphere. And some scientists, some research shows that they are responsible for different emotional experiences. So the left hemisphere is responsible for approach-related anger and for happiness and optimism. I'm angry at you and I'm coming at you and I'm blaming you and I'm letting you know that I'm blaming you. That's
Okay.
approach-related anger. That's me coming toward whoever I'm angry at. Withdrawal-related anger is in the right hemisphere, and that's when you give up, when you don't want to talk to somebody anymore, when you write them out of your life. That's withdrawal-related anger. And that appears to be in the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere also has sadness and shame and fear. And when we're really depressed, the only thing that's left with any activity at all is the deep right amygdala. Just like that's the only thing. It's just like a little coal glowing down there in the brain when people are in major depression. It's almost like the left hemisphere goes completely offline when people are depressed. So the two amygdalas do different things and hold different things and are wired to different parts of the brain. So the right hippocampus and the right amygdala work together to create our felt sense of self and our felt sense of our life, and also seem to hold our traumatic memory. The right amygdala has a sense of time. It's like emotion. Emotion is only located in time because of the events that surround it. Otherwise, it's just kind of an eternal experience that we dip into and dip out of. In my story about my mother, that's an example of the amygdala having no sense of time. And to put this into the context of your previous question, the kind of memory that the amygdala is responsible for is implicit memory. And then the hippocampus is responsible for explicit memory. So the amygdala writes in every unpleasant and difficult experience that we have ever had and tries to make us safe from ever having that experience again. So that's why we have it, even though it gives us trouble, is because it's trying to save us. So my amygdala was trying to save me from the excruciating pain of reaching out and feeling somebody recoil. It's like we're never reaching out again. It writes in the behavioral pattern that was a part of the unpleasant experience, as well as writing in the cues, like somebody you love, or someone with a particular hairstyle, or sometimes you'll be walking down the street and you'll smell a particular perfume or aftershave, and a memory will come of a particular person. The amygdala stores memory by cue, all different kinds of cues, and any rough match with something that the amygdala has perceived as unpleasant and dangerous gets marked, and then the behavioral construct that tries to save us from that experience comes into play. So for me in that moment, the behavioral construct was do not reach out. Here's someone you love who might recoil, do not reach out. And it was unconscious. So that's why I call them unconscious contracts. And we can feel them in our bodies when there's a lot of reactivity. We're in an unconscious contract, something connected with the amygdala has decided that something is unbearable, and it will react with rage to shut down the experience. Or the amygdala has decided that emotional pain, shame, or sadness is unbearable, and there will be a behavioral construct of going to get our addiction. So having some alcohol, or having some chocolate, or having some opioids, some Oxycontin or something, to take care of discomfort and pain. So we are kind of always dancing with our own amygdalas, and this is where our intentionality plays a part. So if we're becoming multimillionaires, then we don't care about emotional cues. And if we're wanting to do emotional growth and transformation work, then we're like, okay, what was that cue? How did that happen?
So amygdala is kind of this place where projections are made.
Absolutely.
With someone, basically this person is not really trying to harm me, but I feel that I am hurt for some reason. That's amygdala remembering some moment from the past. It's very similar to that moment.
Yes, and this will be most intense the more we love someone and the closer we are to them.
You mean the memory or the experience we have in the moment, the projection?
The projections become thicker and deeper and faster and more intense and more prescriptive and more reactive the closer we get to someone.
You actually gave me an answer for something I was questioning for a long time. Because this projection thing, it's something that worried me for so long. I love my wife very much, but sometimes still we have these frictions. And when we just started living together, basically the conflict would arise from nothing when we looked at it from the future, when it ended finally. I wouldn't understand what is happening. Why am I getting angry? Because she's not trying to harm me. So the only decision I made for myself is to put this sign. My wife never wants to harm me. So what's happening with me if I feel it?
Very beautiful.
Can you please share maybe some tricks that you made, or maybe some practices that allow us to get distanced
Yeah.
from that projection in the
Yeah.
moment?
Making the projection explicit is one of the best ways to have the projections fall away. And we can do that with constellation exercises. If we know that somebody's driving us nuts, then we ask ourselves, who's standing behind them? Who is the person, or what is the situation that is most resonant with my pain? Where do I find a similar pain in my past? One of the things that would drive me most crazy was when somebody would tell me that I was lying. And they can be so intense that it can be difficult to tell what the resonance with the past is. You kind of have to turn the volume down a little bit so that the emotional intensity isn't just taking you out. So you kind of imagine yourself with a volume knob, turning the emotion down a little bit. Then you try different people out behind your person. Where does the helplessness and rage that you feel now connect with helplessness and rage that you felt from the past? Is it your mother standing behind? Is it your father standing behind? Is it your best friend from when you were 13 years old standing behind? And I actually had thought it was my mother, but as I'm talking to you now, I'm also trying out my best friend from when I was 13, who used to say things like this to me, and I would feel this intense helplessness. It was like there was no way to reach this person in this moment. So right now, I'm saying to both the Sarah who was throwing the phone and to the Sarah who was 13 years old, of course you would feel this helpless. Do you need acknowledgement that it's like a brick wall has come down and there's no connecting? Do you need acknowledgement that you're suddenly falling through space into a black hole where there's nobody there because this was the person who was most important to you? When we begin to step into a place of compassion for ourselves, and this actually is a movement within the brain that we're doing, because the amygdala is the one that's having the responsiveness, the reactivity. The part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex is the part that we move into when we begin to have self-compassion for ourselves. And there's actually research that shows that if we use our own name when we are speaking kindly to ourselves, it supports this brain movement. It supports this movement. And so if you were to say, Dimitri, of course you're finding yourself losing your temper. You know, if you were to actually say that to yourself, it's like it starts to create just like these little layers of distance between ourselves and our reactivity. That's a part of the intentionality of moving into a world where we are doing less harm to ourselves and others.
When you talked about amygdala, you said that there is a part that gets withdrawn or takes us to withdrawal when we get angry, and there is another part that actually wants to act. Is there any specific reason why some people have more withdrawn part active and the other are more active and want to act and want to do something? Because I'm a kind of person who wants to do something immediately, but I know people who are withdrawn, who maybe get frozen, or who better just prefer not to pick up the phone or just to ignore you for, I don't know, 3 weeks or a month or something like that. Can you please share how it works? Why does it work this way for some of us and it works the other way for the others?
A little bit is, some percentage of it is what we're born with. Are we born with a personality that tends more towards extroversion, or are we born with a personality that tends more towards introversion? So that's the first question. But that's not the most important question, because that's a somewhat fluid experience. The more we do healing work, the more we move to a kind of a middle ground where we're both introverted and extroverted. What's more interesting is what kind of unconscious contracts have we made based on our life experiences. And the unconscious contracts begin really early. So they begin before we are 4 months old, before we have actually even developed any brain territory for language at all. By the time a baby is 4 months old, that baby has completely integrated its primary caretaker's range of facial expressions. So by the time the baby is 4 months old, the baby has already integrated an entire set of unconscious contracts that are about what kinds of emotions can be expressed. So if a mother does not express sadness and cannot reflect sadness, the baby stops broadcasting sadness. If the mother cannot reflect anger, cannot be with anger, she might be angry herself, but the question is, can the mother reflect what's happening in the baby's face? And this is happening really quickly, like a 13th of a second, really almost below the level of conscious awareness. So the baby's sad, the mother can't reflect it, the baby stops showing sadness. The baby's angry, the mother can't reflect it, the baby stops showing anger. The baby's scared, the mother can't reflect it, the baby stops showing fear. Then these become embedded and unconscious amygdala-centered behavioral patterns that we continue to reenact for the rest of our lives until we start to have different experiences with different people. A lot of times people are healed in their marriages in many ways because it's so powerful. We're in amygdala territory when we're in our intimate relationships. And so we continue to be changeable and changed by what we experience. The other question is a nervous system question. So we've got these facial expressions, but we also have the attempts that a baby makes to bring their mother back to life or to calm their mother down. So if the mother is dissociated or withdrawn and the baby protests and the mother responds to that and comes back, then we're starting to embed in the baby's body a habitual pattern of doing approach-related anger that lets the mother come back to connection. Or sometimes the mother withdraws or goes into dissociation or is not available. The baby moves into withdrawal-related anger and the mother comes after the baby to bring the baby back. So this is another way. It's like we don't really think of ourselves as dyadic. We don't really think of ourselves as being paired beings. But humans are paired beings. We're mammalian paired animals. And we are in our original dyadic relationships for the rest of our lives without even knowing it. These things go right into the amygdala. It's the felt sense of being. So whatever behavioral and emotional patterns have been most effective at balancing and restoring connection in the dyad, those become extremely powerful.
Before I started exploring your work, researching on your work, I just heard the word amygdala. I knew that it's a part of the brain now. I understand that it plays such a great and big role in my life. One of the other things that you shared in one of the interviews was about the sheath that gets on our DNA. If it's possible, please share a little bit about it. One of the things that questioning is whether this sheath can actually be dissolved. I understand that our DNA can be sort of mutated, can be changed. So there is sheath coming onto it, but can it come off it? Or is it something that goes just for the rest of our life?
That's a wonderful question. Just to orient our listeners, if you think of the double helix of a DNA strand that are throughout all of our cells, throughout our body, wrapped around the DNA strand is a protein sheath, like a little covering around the DNA. And what it does is it's changed by experience. It can be changed by pollution. It can be changed by environment. It's very intensely changed by whether or not the person that's taking care of us is nurturing. Different ways that we're affected epigenetically in different parts of our body. For example, we have cells in the hypothalamus, which if you think about the amygdala is deep in the brain. If this were the brain, there's the amygdala deep in the brain. Hypothalamus is just above it. And the hypothalamus is the part of the body that responds to stress. And when we do this kind of healing work, we're starting to really lean into these beautiful big ideas like love, faith, trust. connection, community, just all of those words that are in the nonviolent communication tradition connected with needs. When we really lean into those, we can see epigenetic changes happening in the hypothalamus. So then to come back to what I was saying, if you have this sheath around the DNA in the hypothalamus, then the work that we do will change the sheath so that it'll open and allow different genes to be expressed, or close and stop certain genes from being expressed. Some of the genes we want to be expressed and some of the genes we don't want to be expressed. Because sometimes when pollution impacts the epigenetic sheath, then all of a sudden there are genes being expressed that we don't want to have expressed that lead to illness, for example. Those are negative changes, of course, if they lead to illness. My favorite epigeneticist, Moshe Zhif, is the fellow who's done the most interesting research that I've found. Rachel Yehuda has also done a lot of research with the grandchildren of Auschwitz survivors, of people from the Holocaust, looking at the way in which their stress response is epigenetically changed by the experience of the ancestors. We are, to some extent, in relationship not just with our amygdala, but we're also in relationship with the epigenetic inheritance that we've received from our ancestors. So, grandparent who survived the Holocaust, then there's a particular change in the epigenetic sheath which makes them more susceptible to stress and more susceptible to PTSD. It's like they're being born into a dangerous world with a nervous system that's very easily alarmed because the level of danger was so great for the people that went before them. We weren't made to fight to survive. We were made to be nurtured to survive because there's so much more resiliency that comes from being nurtured. And at the same time, there seems to be some kind of mammalian genetic benefit that little mammals receive if their parents and grandparents lived in a dangerous world and they're born into a dangerous world. And they're more alarmist. They may stay alive longer if they're more easily alarmed, if they don't lean into trust. It's a complex picture, this whole question of genetics and epigenetics and what our genetics are trying to prepare us for. And so often our genetics are trying to prepare us for the world that our grandparents lived in rather than this world that we live in now, which then puts us out of sync with this world that we live in now. So if we had grandparents who lived in famine and our epigenetics are preparing our bodies to come into a world where there's famine, but we're coming into a world where there's abundant food, then we may even be more likely to get diabetes, for example, because our bodies are expecting famine, but they're being given abundance, and it's a mismatch. There's a mismatch between our grandparents' world and our world. And of course, you know, the history of humans on the planet is tens of thousands of years old, and there were tens of thousands of years where life did not change so radically from generation to generation as it changes now. There's a very interesting piece about the world changing so quickly and our epigenetics not quite being prepared for the world that we're living in. At the same time, the more healing work we do, the more our nervous systems have an easier time with stress.
One last question to specify. We get the DNA from our parents.
Yeah.
Is there a chance that we can pass on better DNA to our children? That's the question. So we have...
Yeah, that's a great question. And the epigenetic stuff doesn't change the DNA. It's not a mutation. It's just a revealing of certain genes or a covering of certain genes. The mutations are when the genes themselves change in the double helix. But the epigenetics are just like, are we revealing genes? Are we covering them? And sometimes revealing them is good and sometimes covering them is good. It just depends on the gene.
Can you please share how listeners can find you, what they can read about you or from what you do?
Oh, thank you. The website is empathybrain.com. That's all one word. There's a book website called yourresonantself.com, and that's the name of the book as well. And it has a nice little animated film on it, and it's fun. And then there are free guided meditations in English that are on the yourresonantself.com website that go with the book.
I'll leave all the links in the description to this podcast
Thank you.
as well. Sarah, thank you very much. It's such a loving and healing space that comes with you.
Thank you.
And I also hope to meet you in person when you come to Moscow as well.
Oh, thank you. I look forward to that.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.